the idea that students going hungry or not having enough to eat or not eating very well, just somehow part of the experience. It's a marketing ploy that students are going to eat ramen for every day for 3 weeks. What foods you're able to eat, how you eat them, who you eat them with, that I think are an important part of people's health and well-being. How can we ensure that students at Guelph are making good food memories? And that for us encompasses the income question, the what you eat, the how you eat, the who you eat with questions, both being necessary but not sufficient on their own income and the food provision things.
Hi, welcome back. Welcome back to the Zero Hunger Project podcast. And today I have a good friend and somebody who's done so much amazing work working on food security in post-secondary campuses. So without much delay, I'm going to pass on to my co-host. I am Suman Roy.
I'm Stacey O'Neill.
And Stacey is willing to introduce our guest to you.
I'm very pleased to introduce you today to Sam Laban. Sam is in charge of the day-to-day management of the Guelph Lab. He is responsible for developing and managing projects, designing and facilitating workshops, developing partnerships and brokering research and scholarly work. He works with the City of Guelph staff, university staff, faculties, and students, as well as with citizens of all stripes, businesses, community organizations, groups, and individuals, to develop promising solutions to pressing challenges facing the region, Welcome, Sam.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
My first question is, what is the Guelph Lab, please?
Good question. The Guelph Lab, we don't collect blood samples. We're not doing experiments in test tubes or anything like that. The Guelph Lab is now a 10-year partnership between the City of Guelph and the University of Guelph. And the lab really exists as kind of a research and development arm of the City of Guelph. So when there are new policies, programs, services being imagined or redesigned at the City of Guelph, the role of the Guelph Lab is to bring research knowledge and community knowledge to bear on those policy-making processes. So what that looks like in practice really is a project is identified, can be by university or city staff or members of the community or organizations we work with. And then we'll get groups of people together, think through a problem. There's a heavy emphasis on learning and experimentation, and then we're normally involved in the sort of implementation and prototyping of those new policies and programs within the City of Guelph.
Nice. I was saying to Suman before we started talking that Guelph really has it going on. I think as a city, there's all kinds of really rad stuff that's coming out of Guelph.
Yeah. But listening to what Guelph Lab does, can we have a Canada lab? Because Canada needs this.
Yes.
We're not the only ones. There are lots of we have lots of comparators. There's lots of good work happening in the kind of field of social innovation. So I couldn't profess to be the only or the unique, but I feel proud of what we're trying to do in Guelph and some of the good things we're doing.
You're part of the vanguard. You're part of the vanguard for sure, though.
Sam, we have worked together in the past, and we have had various conversations around food insecurity in post-secondary campuses for quite a few years now. How is it going? Like, not only just in Guelph, but overall in that sector in Canada, how is food security in campuses, post-secondary campuses going right now?
Well, I think it probably depends a little bit on how you define good. Maybe I'll go with the good news first, and then the heavy caveat that sort of says, well, is that good news? So I would say in the last 5 years, there probably isn't a university campus. It may be a little different for colleges, but there isn't a university across Canada that isn't now regularly collecting data about the prevalence of food insecurity amongst students on their campuses. All universities participate in these regular surveys of student health and well-being. And the two biggest ones, there's a Canadian one and an American one that lots of Canadian institutions regularly use, now include the sort of standard 5-question survey about food insecurity as part of their core questions that are asked to students. So I think, I don't know the definite number, but I would be shocked if it's not 95% of campuses across Canada could now tell you within the last 2 years what is the prevalence rate of food insecurity, and that they will now begin to be able to track that over time. That is useful, I think. Maybe not good, but useful.
Yeah, so I don't like calling that good. I get why you have a hesitation around calling that good.
Yes. So I think that's useful. I think what is good is that there are a plethora, lots and lots of campuses that have one or two programs, initiatives that respond to food insecurity amongst students, mainly on the food provision side. I think there are some universities, I would tentatively and semi-proudly say Guelph is one of them, that has lots of responses, a growing number of responses, which is positive. We in Guelph, for example, we run a food prescription program. We have a sliding scale food market. We have community fridges. For 20 years, Guelph has had a student-run food bank. We have some, a lot of those programs reflect kind of really interesting and promising collaboration between students and staff. The data is useful. The new programs are good because they didn't exist previously. I think this is where you were going. The hesitancy about calling it good is that you can definitely debate the prevalence rates amongst students. There's some suggestion that students maybe respond to the standard questions a little differently than other households, because when you ask students about their experience, it can be quite different, summertime versus term time, whether they're living at home, all those kinds of things. But however you count, the number of students who have food security is probably pretty big.
That is where I was coming
So
to.
that's not good. And I think people would find that surprising, actually. I mean, when you're talking about food security and insecurity, it's not very common for people to talk about the demographic of post-secondary students.
Exactly. And I think, Sam, one thing I just wanted to peel the layers a little bit, and we're talking about food insecurity data in all campuses or 90% of the campuses. For somebody who is listening to our podcast or watching it, who do not understand what post-secondary food insecurity means, are you able to unpack it a little bit? What does that really mean?
Yeah, so the numbers description of it is that most conservative estimate is something like 14% of students would be considered food insecure. The most common reports, there's the common campus surveys I mentioned, the way they end up calculating food insecurity says it's 20, 30, even 40% of students would be considered food insecure. So that's the numbers part of it. And like I say, you could get into some really esoteric debates about whether the number is 14% or 40%. Either of those numbers are...
Yeah, they're both terrible.
Yeah, for Guelph, for example, Guelph is a medium-sized university. If the number was 14%, somewhere like 3,000 students out of a population, 27,000 students. So 3,000 people, right? That's the small number, which is a big number. That's the numbers description. The qualitative description, and we can get into if it's useful to talk about how student insecurity may be similar or different to food insecurity amongst other populations. I think that is useful to talk about. But the qualitative, like the lived experience of this, and Suman, we did some of this work together when in your previous role in life as the leader of Meal Exchange. So, for example, we, in response to Meal Exchange's Racial Life Student Caucus, who put out calls to say, hey, the food movement needs to do a better job of centering the leadership and the lived experience of students of racialized communities. We wanted to kind of heed that call, and so work with Suman's organization to host a series of workshops where we brought together students with lived experience of food insecurity, BIPOC students with lived experience of food insecurity. And there's a really neat organization based at U of Guelph called the Reunion Center, and they work on topics like this, and they have this really brilliant process where they lead people with lived experience, tends to be lived experience of topics that carry a lot of stigma, and they train them to create digital stories, so like 2 to 4 minute stories about their own experience. And the people that the people with this experience, they own those stories. They give permission about where those stories can and can't be streamed. What we hear is that, and what we see is that it's a useful experience for people to spend time. Often, we did one in person, one remote, to talk with others who have similar experiences. So what we hear in these stories that students shared generously, that they face a lot of the dilemmas that I think people imagine when they imagine people who are living with food insecurity. So these horrible, impossible choices. One of the stories concludes with the line, we should not have to choose. And so the person's story is about these debates about where should I spend my final amount of resources? The story includes, should I go and get breakfast, or should I take the bus to campus? How much money do I have? These kinds of things. The debates about when have you gone too far by borrowing from friends and family, whether it's money or food. Uh, the experience of isolation, as one student talked about sitting alone in her room at night, sometimes eating, sometimes not, and how that feels and what the effects of that are like. In lots of ways, I think student food security is similar to and the same as the experiences of food security amongst other members of the community.
But I also think, when you're at university, you're sort of not quite a kid and not quite an adult. So there's a part of that where you're supposed to be figuring all of these things out. I mean, isn't that part of the post-secondary experiences that you're trying to, but you can't do that if you're starving. And, if you're having this experience of going out and trying to figure out who you're going to be and what is okay for you and what is not okay for you, you also have to negotiate how you ask people, as you were saying, how do I tell people that I'm floundering, that I'm actually in trouble? This isn't a growth experience. I'm starving. I'm hungry. And my whole family, in some cases, are depending on the fact that I get this education because I'm going back to wherever I came from. And I can't function and I don't have anybody to ask to help me. Like, I couldn't think of anything more alienating.
And we see that. So we've got data from Guelph, for example, that students who are food insecure were, and I won't get the exact number right, but twice as likely to report that their mental health was languishing. And so we definitely want to not think of these things in isolation. So, there's not a population of students who are food insecure and a population who are experiencing poor mental health. So we want to think of those things together. And there's a couple of other things you mentioned. Part of the work, I think, that has been done, students have been at the forefront of this, staff and universities and institutions, I think, are sort of coming to it lately, is that to some extent, this is an issue that's been hiding in plain sight, right? The myth of student hunger, and a myth meaning it is so prevalent, the idea that students going hungry or not having enough to eat or not eating very well is just somehow part of the experience. It's not even just part of the experience. Like it's actually, it's funny, right? There's pizza and pops for student discount night. Like, it's a marketing ploy that, the students are going to eat ramen for every day for 3 weeks. I was going to say, what I think is changing is that myth is being exploded a bit. And to your point, to say that yes, there may be some students for whom that is an okay part of the experience, that some of it is funny and some of it doesn't have any consequences, short or long term, but that for many students, that's not true.
Yeah, because this is not a character building exercise. Like, I ate some of the worst food in my life at university. There are whole subreddits about things you can fix with ramen noodles, like bathtubs and car bumpers. And like, it's not food, right? And I remember waking up one morning at like 6 a.m. and realizing that I had Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and fettuccine noodles in my cupboard, and that was it. And I ate them, but I called my mother and she said, "How are things going?" And I said, "This is what I have to eat." And she's like, "You'll figure it out." But here's the thing. If push came to shove, I could call somebody and they would send me money. That is not the experience of an inordinate amount of people. They have that is not character building. It's othering and terrifying.
Exactly. And Sam, when I was with Meal Exchange, there was, I'm not going to name the person here. It was an elected official. And when we were advocating for post-secondary, and that person exactly said, "Oh, it was the same experience I had. Look at me. I'm fine."
Because
that rhetoric.
Yeah.
It's that rhetoric that drives me crazy.
That has so much to do with socioeconomic factors that have absolutely nothing to do with a university experience.
No, because hungry bellies will not get good students out of university, and that is their only job.
Well, and it's so stressful anyway. Yes. I mean, the whole thing is so stressful anyway.
So, Sam, with one thing that I'm really happy to hear, in the past few years, I haven't been very involved with the post-secondary side of it, but from where I left off and where we are, what I'm hearing right now, I'm really excited that there are at least most campuses are recognizing that this is a problem.
Progress is being made.
Which I think is great.
Yeah.
That at least they're understanding and they're doing research and they're collecting data. Now, what are one or two policies that you would recommend for a post-secondary campus to make food security better for their students?
Good question. So if I can, I'll just backtrack a little bit as an important caveat here. And your points about the elected official that you'd spoken to, which students are able to borrow, ask for, be loaned, funds, support, whatever. Some students can do that, some can't. I think one of the things that we are trying to hold on to and be clear about is that while there may be some unique interventions that can happen in the post-secondary space, and I'll speak to those in a second, it's probably not the primary determining factor is probably not that that person is a student. To your point, there's wide diversity within students, and that's not the primary determining factor. It's the confluence of being a student and having low income, or being a student and having a dependent or dependents, or the confluence of being a student who's coming, whose family or household background is low income. So the important sort of clarification there, or thing that we try, need to hold on to. I'm really glad the way you asked that question, because I do firmly believe that we wouldn't want to get, as the post-secondary, we get into a position where we are advocating for students to be targeted for food insecurity interventions as a kind of, if there's a zero-sum game about where to target food insecurity dollars. Because I think if you target food insecurity dollars well, you're going to hit most of the students who are food insecure.
Through other avenues, you mean?
Yes, exactly. So if you think about the Canada Child Benefit Program, or those things should benefit the students who are also, tick those boxes or have those experiences as well. Having said all of those things, the reason I say them is because colleagues who I'm working with here in Guelph, the students we're working with, I think we're in the position of sort of saying, universities cannot do this alone, but I do think there's lots that universities can do, and in most cases there is probably more that universities can do. The way I like to think of this is that if we were to say talk to both of you and say, hey, what do you think you could do around food security if you were educator, employer, caterer, healthcare provider, landlord to the population of the community you're trying to serve?
Is this predicated, though, on a country having a social safety net? I mean, what if you're talking to a country that doesn't?
So I'm talking about this from the point of view of universities. So as a university, that's the set of relationships that you have with your students. You are employer, educator. How that plays out in countries that don't have the same kind of social safety net, I would probably be remiss to do. I don't think I'm the person to ask that question, because and the outside my wheelhouse. I feel strongly that if I'm not informed, I shouldn't have strong opinions on.
No, fair enough.
Totally.
It's more of a social commentary than anything else. I mean, at least in this country, there are, back channels and other ways and other means.
Yes, and I think part of the task that's before universities was thinking about how they interact with those things and can maybe complement. So there's been, again, maybe progress, but not the best news on the Canada Disability Benefit. It's not as generous as it ought to be, or maybe generous is the wrong word. It's not as sufficient as it ought to be, or adequate as it needs to be. The universities need to think about how they, how the students that they have this relationship for, this extensive, interesting relationship, employer, educator, healthcare provider, caterer, landlord. That's a lot of levers that you can pull. You can have some benefits. So the University of Guelph, I mentioned, we run our food prescription program. We currently support about 150 students with a weekly amount of spendable food. And we have sliding scale food markets. I think those kinds of interventions are useful and interesting to think about. I think especially my perspective is, I think you're looking for this sort of hybridized governance where you have student leadership, but institutional might. Big institutions are good at things like space and infrastructure and finances and things like that, but where they can be in partnership with community who benefit from, or your tremendous support, who are best placed to decide how to leverage that infrastructure. I think that's great. So I'll take that early campus sliding scale food market, started in collaboration with two students. We run 3 days a week, 3 different locations. We have some staff, including me, who kind of provide some of the backstop infrastructure, figuring out some of the things in the back end. But it's really led by students. So the market coordinator, who's in a paid position as a graduate student, Each location has a sort of shift and location lead, and they're all students. And there are 45 students that signed up to volunteer for a couple of hours each shift. And they help really, I think, to drive and determine, like, is this thing going to be successful? What are the decisions we can make about what kinds of foods, where should we be, those kinds of things. So on the food provision side, I think that's an interesting, this hybridized approach where it's university infrastructure, space, capacity, in some cases funding. We use the university's food supplier because that means we can get on Thursdays when we run all day, we can get 2 deliveries in that day. So the food that's out at the market is always high quality. It's never more than 2 hours after being delivered off the truck. So that's great on that side. I think an underexplored place. I mean, this is the chance to put it in perspective. Almost every university is already engaged in income supports for students through financial aid. My understanding is that, and this is the thing I'm really curious about for Guelph, for example, is my understanding that over time, whilst the amount of financial aid has grown, the proportion that goes needs-based versus merit-based has shifted. So needs-based means financial aid for students that demonstrate in various ways that they don't have sufficient money to live well or to meet their basic needs. Is needs-based, and then merit-based is things that are offered to the highest performing students, for example, as an incentive to come to the university. I think even small shifts in that proportion of how those dollars are allocated would actually unlock huge value. So, for most universities, the food provision side of things is measured in the tens and maybe, hopefully hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of the university. But the financial aid budget is measured in millions of dollars. And so universities in lots of ways are doing good work to intervene to increase students' incomes, which is obviously a really positive thing. And I think that would be a small shift that could have an outsized impact. Is to shift a 5 or 10% shift in the allocation of those budgets between needs-based and merit-based would unlock, probably millions of dollars that can be targeted to students who are experiencing material deprivation, that don't have sufficient funds to meet their basic needs.
Interesting. Does it make any difference that Guelph is in an agriculturally rich part of the country? I mean, is that helping you any? And what about the places that aren't?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? I'm sure you do grapple with the question about whether an increase in income gets us all the way. And so one of the reflections I've had personally, really, I think really driven by the stories that I mentioned in these workshops, we had about, I think, 22 students in the end who created these short stories. And I've had the fortune to be able to watch them multiple times. They're rich, they're interesting, they're compelling, moving, insightful. I mentioned that one student story, and she describes the experience of being in her room every night eating the same meal, and sometimes not eating enough. She talks about sort of eating a boiled egg every time. And so it poses an interesting question, like if she was actually eating a nutritionally sufficient meal every night alone in her room, and it was the same one, have we reached the end goal? And I'm not sure. And for me personally, I don't think we have. I don't think that's our North Star. Both sides of that equation are necessary but not sufficient. So the income stuff is necessary, but I don't think it gets us. There are important things about self-determination, agency, about community, about the kinds of foods that are available, about how what foods you're able to eat, how you eat them, who you eat them with, that I think are an important part of people's health and well-being. So if we take a really narrow definition, if we want to address food insecurity, and food insecurity is literally a measure of financial means, then income will address food insecurity. But if we think that community and and well-being and belonging and mental health and vibrant sort of cultural experiences through food are also important, then I don't know that income is sufficient on its own. It probably gets us some of the way.
It's an interesting point.
Getting fed is sort of not enough,
No.
right?
and getting fed the right thing
Well, this is what I'm
is the
saying. Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Great point. I've got a burning question on this. Not on this, but in this topic. So you mentioned, Sam, that the university cannot do this alone. I 100% agree. Do you have any policy recommendation for the provincial or federal government that you think will help this situation?
I think there's probably, I mean, I would probably even look to both of you in terms of the outside of the education portfolio. I would probably follow the lead of folks like you. And because as I mentioned, I think um, I don't know. I wouldn't go to SPEC, but I wouldn't be going to them and say, "Hey, you should," in the same way you have there's now a school food program. That you should be spending those dollars or similar dollars on a post-secondary student food program. So I would follow other folks, as I mentioned. I think there's good work being done around, lots of good work and important work being done around increasing incomes for people with disabilities, the kind of child benefit, things like that, that will benefit students who are experiencing food insecurity. So I think outside the education portfolio, I would follow the lead of other people. In terms of policy recommendations, funding for post-secondary education was a huge topic, lots of challenges. No one can quite figure out which way is the right way to do this. The last couple of years, certainly in Ontario, but nationally, I would say as well, the question about funding for post-secondary institutions has been dominated by the question of international students.
It's a convenient target. They're a convenient target.
And they are entirely not the perpetrators of these problems. They are entirely the victims. These are, in many, many cases, I think the idea of the majority of international students coming to Canada being the sort of cream of the crop from their home countries, the most privileged students in there. We have left that behind a long, long time ago, and many of the students are bright, brilliant people. We're fortunate that they're interested in coming to Canada, and they are undertaking huge personal and familial risks to come. And then when they get here, they are often experiencing the most sort of extreme forms of deprivation. Like they are a group of students who are really struggling completely unfairly. I mean, there are stories about food programs who I do understand are under pressure, turning international students away. It's a really interesting thought exercise, right? That these international students on a full pay-as-you-go like life in Canada, right? They pay top whack.
They're bringing millions of dollars into these institutions
and to our economy.
Yeah,
and to local and national economies. So they've been villainized. I think universities and colleges didn't do a good job of getting in front of that issue and figuring out how there not to be some externalities on local programs. But in part, universities were doing what education policy had asked them to do, which was to be more entrepreneurial because core funding was being reduced. I will confess, I don't know that I have the specific policy recommendation, but there is something in and around post-secondary funding. We are involved in a project that is trying to figure out, unfortunately working with Dr. Gwen Chapman, who is the former provost at U of Guelph, on a project where we're trying to figure out what is the extent and the limitations of universities' role as individual institutions in responding to food insecurity, because there are some things they can do. Their budget's strapped. It's a really interesting thought exercise. Part of that project is, what is the social contract between universities and their students? What should universities, what are they offering to the students that come? Almost every university in Canada has a policy on gender-based violence. Most of them have policies on mental health and programming around mental health. Some of them are beginning to deliver programming and make commitments and supports around food insecurity. All of those things seem sensible and useful and necessary, but they are hard to do. They're hard to do well. They create additional demands on budgets and on staff and on students' time and energy. And so there's just an interesting question about how to reconcile these things. Universities, we know, and this is an important point to mention about student food insecurity, that students are an interesting group because in some ways they are participating in an intervention that will ultimately be a pretty good protective factor against food insecurity further in their lifetime. If we can get them to graduate, and if we can narrow the gaps, and they are narrowing, I think that is a good news story within Canada. The gaps between different ethnicities, the gaps between household income levels, and post-secondary attainment are narrowing, which is a really, which I think is an unheralded good news story within Canada. It's about the experience when they're at university and the knock-on effects that has. There are short-term consequences: health, well-being, mental health, well-being, and because we know these things like food insecurity are heavily influenced by ongoing historical inequities and oppressions. It's about, can we continue to ensure that university is that vehicle of social mobility, that vehicle of future protection against food insecurity in a really equitable way?
This is the thing I find so frustrating, because these are in fact human rights issues.
Exactly.
I mean, why are we even having these conversations? I don't understand. I just find it so infuriating. And the fact that we have to, talk about, do you have a violence against or gender-based violence program, or do you have a food security program? Like, how are you going to spend these dollars? I mean, I understand it intellectually, emotionally, it just incenses me. I guess on that note, if we could these conversations are always so hard because you come banging up against these huge existential problems, but best case scenario for you, Sam, what does that look like?
In terms of, I think our North Star, or at least I'll say for me personally, our North Star, we're beginning to use it will sound a bit flippant, and it's not intended to be, how can we ensure that students at Guelph are making good food memories? And that for us encompasses the income question, the what you eat, the how you eat, the who you eat with questions, both being necessary but not sufficient on their own income and the food provision things. Best case scenario is, I think for us, some growth in the food side of that. And I think there is some momentum around that within Guelph. I think there is some opportunity for novel and interesting new programming. Maybe new or novel for post-secondary, probably going to continue to learning a lot from the community sector. I think some shifts in the financial aid thinking and model would be terrific. And I think it wouldn't be unreasonable for institutions to set some smart, ambitious goals around, because we have these intervention points and because we know a lot about students. I think we should be, a sort of call to be ambitious, something like halving the rate of severe food insecurity among students, because I think there's a reasonable proposition that students experiencing severe food insecurity likely have, these intersecting experiences, are most at risk of, their grades slipping or taking long to graduate or dropping out altogether. And that's a really big issue and concern. I think those students are probably the most at risk of experiencing the other symptoms of food insecurity, whether it, the things that come with low diet quality, the things that come with feelings of isolation. So for me, I think universities could do that. I mean, it obviously is dependent a little bit on what shifts contextually, how rates of food insecurity shift among the broader community. But I can't imagine a scenario, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm not in the sort of branding and communications and marketing world, but an instance where a university that sets an ambitious goal on something like this and does genuine work towards it but doesn't meet that goal gets blowback, right? I think, who's going to say, hey, you said you would halve severe food insecurity and you only moved, 500 students out of severe food insecurity. What were you doing? How dare you? You failed, and that's bad. So that is my, maybe naive, but I think that's what I'd love to see.
I like that. That seems doable. It feels doable. And it feels like something that the students themselves can participate in, instead of just sitting around waiting for somebody to help them, that they could actively participate in, drawing attention to these things. And these films that you're talking about are the types of things that it opens them up to a certain measure of vulnerability. But on the other hand, they're passing along incredibly important bits of information to people who wouldn't otherwise know, what their private suffering is.
Exactly. And important to point out here that it's not that students, that kind of thing is where students could get involved. Students already are. Right, students, as I pointed out, we are playing catch up. The Central Student Association, so the Undergraduate Student Association at Guelph, founded the Campus Food Bank 20 years ago. And we're the latecomers to this. So we've been involved for 5 years. They've been going for 20 years. The Graduate Students Association at Guelph has committed funding to the food prescription program. So they're doing programming, but they're also helping distribute funds. So students are involved. They have been involved. They've been at the front of it, and it isn't going to work if they're not involved. Right? It's going to fall down. It's going to be unresponsive. It's not going to hit the mark. It's not going to be. I think it's hard to imagine if I'm sure, like many others, when we're in this sort of work with dignity is an important principle, and I think there's something really powerful and important about acts of solidarity, peer support, where I think we're not. So we use the campus side and scale food market that we're involved in. It's not a sort of it's not just operationally necessary or operationally useful that students are the kind of engine behind that program. It is a critical component of its success. It's why people enjoy the experience of going there at length and probably overly long, in a long-winded way, agree with your point that students can get involved in that. They are involved. They have been involved. They've been in leadership, and it would fail without them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the work you're doing is so important and so impactful. And this information, I think, is vital to disseminate out to the population at large. I don't think people have any idea about this.
Exactly. And Sam, we can talk about this for hours and hours, as you know, but we have a timeline for this. I just want to thank you for your time and sharing your expertise and wisdom. This was a lot for our viewers and our listeners. This is a problem.
Yeah.
This is a problem. We heard in the best case scenario, thousands of students in one campus might be food insecure. And this is a problem not only in Canada, it's in all developed countries, it's across.
Yeah.
And some countries like Finland, like China, has come out with solutions, and we hope the other countries follow suit. Because the youth, we talk at the UN level, everywhere we want to empower the youth, but youth cannot be empowered with a hungry belly.
If they're starving, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I hope you learned a lot from our guest today, Sam. Please write any comments, any notes that you want to share with us. We'll be more than happy, and follow Sam's program. Guelph Lab is doing a great job.
And we'll put all the links below for everything that Sam is doing.
Thank you so much, Sam, once
Thanks,
again.
Sam.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been great talking with you.
Take care.